everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Amanda Tremont, and I am an assistant director in the Office of Alumni Engagement at Tufts. It's so wonderful to see so many of you here tonight. We are so excited to be welcoming Andrew Gottlieb, who is going to be talking about an incredibly topical and relevant conversation, especially for those of you who live on Cape Cod. Before we kick off Andrew's presentation, I'm going to toss things over to Len DiLorenzo. Len is one of our most very loyal members. He's an alum and also the president of the Cape Cod Tufts Club. So without further ado, I will toss things over to Len.
Thank you, Amanda. I'm the vice president of the Tufts Club, and I'm filling in for the president, who's Mike Duffy. And he is in Hawaii working on his golf game right now. I want to welcome 146 participants to today's program. In addition to members of the Tufts community from around the country, we have many members from the Intercollegiate Alumni Clubs of Cape Cod, including alumni from MIT, Harvard, and Cornell. Through your generosity when registering for this event, we have been able to raise over $1,100 for the Cape Cod Tufts Club Scholarship Fund. This fund allows us to award 3 $2,500 scholarships per year to deserving, currently enrolled Tufts students from the Cape Islands and the South Coast areas. A few housekeeping items before we start the program. This meeting will be recorded and uploaded to our Tufts Alumni YouTube channel and the Cape Cod Tufts Club website. You will notice your audio and video are disabled. Once we begin, you will see the presenter on your screen. You will be able to hear him, but he will not be able to hear or see you. You may need to adjust your volume. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, you can do so by clicking the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen. This will open a window where you can type in your questions. After the presentation, Amanda will read the questions to our speaker for him to answer. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Andrew Gottlieb, the Executive Director of the Association to Preserve Cape Cod, APCC. Andrew has a BA from Harvard and an MBA from Boston University. He has more than 30 years of environmental protection experience in government and elected terms in municipal office. Andrew is serving his 5th term on the Mashpee Board of Selectmen. He has served as a water and sewer commissioner, has been a board member of the Massachusetts Climate Action Network, and is a trustee of Cape Cod Community College. Andrew's extensive and impressive environmental credentials are listed in the webinar invitation. Now here's Andrew Gottlieb.
Great. Thanks, Len. Good to have an opportunity to talk to everybody. For those that don't know APCC, we are a region-wide environmental advocacy and education organization. APCC has been around since 1968, and we pride ourselves in being science-based and an aggressive advocate for the environment on Cape Cod. We've worked on a number of issues over the years that are addressing the biggest threats to the Cape's environment, and that has changed over the years. When we were first organized, we were responding to proposal by the Army Corps of Engineers to dredge the Great Nauset Marsh to make it a deep water harbor. And over the years, our interests and focus have shifted in accordance with the needs of the region. We were an important player in the creation of the Cape Cod Land Bank, Cape Cod Commission, most recently the Cape Cod Water Protection Trust Fund. And in my now 4 years at APCC, we've been focused largely on water quality. And in addition to obviously climate change and other issues as they pop up, whether it's the multi-purpose machine gun range proposed at Joint Base Cape Cod, or the recently floated absurd idea of discharging nuclear contaminated wastewater from the Plymouth decommissioning into Cape Cod Bay. So where we are needed, we try to make ourselves available to help the Cape. But one of the things that we've been focusing on consistently the last several years has been water quality. And part of that effort has been to address and promote a broader understanding of the general population of Cape Cod, as well as political decision makers, both locally and across the region, of what some of the causes of water quality degradation are, and what can and should and needs to be done in order to stop some of the trends that we're seeing. And one of the tools that we've developed that enables us to do this and communicate, I think, effectively to the broader public, something we called State of the Waters Cape Cod. And so we just released a couple of weeks ago our third annual update for State of the Waters. And I'm going to walk you through what our findings are and talk a little bit about some of the underlying issues. But just as a precursor, most of the water quality problems we have when we're talking about our estuaries, our nearshore embayment areas, as well as our freshwater ponds, are driven by the choice, the conscious choice that Cape Cod has made over the years to not have advanced wastewater treatment systems and to rely on backyard septic systems to process the vast majority of wastewater on Cape Cod. And why that's a problem is that septic systems are designed to do one thing and one thing only: prevent human exposure to pathogens on the surface of the ground. And they do that quite well. And the reason they do that quite well is that our soils are sandy, they're extremely permeable. And as most of us know, water flows down through the soils pretty quickly. And that is both the benefit of using septic systems, but also the problem. And the problem is that septic systems, as designed, do almost nothing to remove nutrients from human waste. And so the nitrogen that comes, the vast majority of it, from urine, and phosphorus that comes from the breakdown of waste and potentially the introduction of consumer products into your septic systems, go down your toilet, into your septic system, and are carried very effectively below the surface into the groundwater. And they are both have the ability to move in the groundwater. Nitrogen moves, is quite water soluble and moves rather quickly. Phosphorus moves at a somewhat slower rate. But like all groundwater on Cape Cod, it goes to one of a couple of places. Flows to the nearest surface water feature. So if you live near a pond, the effluent, the groundwater with whatever effluent came out of your septic system flows with that groundwater, goes to the pond. If you live closer to a stream, it picks up in the stream. If it's not picked up by either of those, it ultimately discharges to a saltwater feature. And 90% of the landmass of Cape Cod is in an area that drains to one of our estuaries. And when that groundwater transports, it brings those nutrients with it, and they create a cascading series of problems that impair the surface water, makes it unaesthetic, unpleasant to be around, unpleasant to swim in. But more importantly, in the marine environment, it results in the loss of the healthy habitat, loss of eelgrass. Eelgrass both provides oxygen to our water column and provides for healthy bays, but also very importantly provides important spawning and nursery habitat for native shellfish and finfish that are important both recreationally, economically, and ecologically to the region. If you wonder why you can't find native scallop in more than just a few locations on Cape Cod, and why native bay scallops are so expensive. It's because we've wiped out their habitat and that eelgrass. In the freshwater systems, we have a different set of scenarios, but it all comes back to over fertilizing the water column, promoting the growth of excessive amounts of algae, and doing it in a way that it disrupts the ecosystem. And the freshwater world provides some potential concerns about toxicity because of some of the algae types that are actually allowed to proliferate, and we're measuring those. So what we have done is provided a state of the waters report. And I'll tell you this, that the full report can be found at one of two ways. You can go on the apcc.org website and scroll down a little bit and you'll find State of the Waters report, or you can go to cleanwaters.org and also find the report that way as well. So I'm going to give you a quick look now at the overview of the maps that depict what we're talking about. And very simply, this map at its highest level shows water quality snapshot for almost every embayment on Cape Cod. And simply put, red is bad, blue is good. And what you'll see here is that on the south-facing Cape, there is no blue. And one of the major findings of our report this year is that there is no longer an embayment that shows high-quality waters on the south-facing Cape Cod, which is a pretty stunning and sobering finding. There's almost no high-quality waters on the west side of Cape Cod facing Buzzards Bay. There are a few on the north side of the Cape. And the reason for that are a couple. One is that the northern side tends to have a somewhat less dense development, fewer septic systems than the south side. The north side embayments tend to be much more open to the open ocean and experience much greater tidal flow changes with each incoming and outgoing tide, somewhere in the 10 to 12 foot range, whereas the south side and west side tidal exchange is much lower, 2 to 3 feet typically, and the embayments themselves have more heavily developed watersheds, more septic waste finding its way to those embayments, and the openings to the cleaner waters of Nantucket Sound tend to be somewhat smaller. And so what this chart shows is that 87% of the embayments, so 41 of the 47 that we measure, fail to meet water quality standards somewhere within that embayment. There are a multitude of sampling stations in each one of these embayments. Generally speaking, the water quality in the stations closer to the outlet tend to be a little bit better water quality. The ones that are further up in the estuaries, up in some of these saltwater rivers, tend to be somewhat worse. They're impacted more directly from groundwater with nitrogen in it. They tend to get less tidal exchange through each tide cycle. So you can, in some of these places, find better waters, but the extent to which you're finding better waters is becoming more and more infrequent as we look at each of the individual stations, which basically means that as nitrogen has been put into the groundwater over the last several decades, it takes time to travel down from where it's discharged down to these estuaries. And we've got a large residual load of nitrogen that's working its way through the groundwater and is making things worse, even though some towns have finally begun to implement changes to their wastewater management programs, which over the long term will yield important results and result in improvement of conditions. But while those things are being implemented and in their initial startup phase, things will continue to get a little bit worse. There's not that much room for them to get worse. There aren't that many high quality stations left. And we'll see on a year-to-year basis how those respond to conditions that we're experiencing. I think that the objective of this report, as I said earlier, was to convey to people that we have a problem, but also over time, we're fully expecting to begin to be able to measure improvement as opposed to further decline, which is where the scenario that we're currently in right now. So the next one that I want to show you is freshwater ponds. And freshwater ponds are, there are almost 1,000 freshwater ponds on Cape Cod. We tend to be identified by our coastal resources, but we have a large number of freshwater ponds on the Cape that are relatively underutilized and somewhat underappreciated, and for which there's a lot less known. So this map shows you, again, red is bad, blue is good, the ponds that we monitored in 2020. And we were able to monitor something around 10%, which is not a particularly satisfactory number of ponds, but we've been growing this program rapidly over the last several years. One of the challenges we face is that unlike the estuarine resources, where we have a very robust data set, long-term, multiple stations, that has allowed us to gain a fairly precise understanding of what the threats to those resources are and how water quality is trending. In the ponds, the data set is much less widely distributed. Fewer ponds are under monitoring, and those that are monitored don't have the depth of record that one would want to see in order to be able to fully understand exactly what's happening with the ponds. And in fact, our data set was very limited for the number of ponds that we could look at that had chemical monitoring, and we were able to supplement that with the cyanobacteria monitoring that we were able to do in the program we've been growing. And so the vast majority of these grades reflect the suitability of the pond water based on our measured observations of the presence of cyanobacteria in quantities that might be considered toxic, that resulted in the town imposing a recommendation to limit your exposure to the ponds, to limit potential exposure to cyanotoxins for some portion of the year. And I touched briefly on the cyano thing, but I want to get back to it a little bit more detail now. Cyanobacteria are a natural part of a healthy ecosystem. They are some of the oldest living organisms on planet Earth, and they are widely felt to be at least partially responsible for the oxygenation of the early Earth atmosphere. And because when it was created, the planet was hot, cyanobacteria are well acclimated and adapted to a warmer temperature regime. And I'll come back to why that's important in a minute. They also, like all plants, like to get fed. And so if you look at what we're doing to our ponds, we are warming the water temperature because we are warming the atmosphere. So our ponds are running warmer. They're getting warmer for a longer part of the year. They're hotter than is typical in our recent historic record. And although it's ironic to say so today, they stay cold for a lesser period of the year than they normally would, although today they're plenty cold. So when you turn up the heat and you add fertilizer, plants grow. And that's what's happening in our ponds. It's happening in our estuaries too. The difference here is that the phosphorus is the controlling nutrient in the growth of cyanobacteria. And you do have this element when populations of cyanobacteria grow to a certain density, certain species of cyanobacteria, of which there are many, can create toxic compounds that have a wide range of effects depending upon your sensitivity as well as the dose. And it can range from anywhere from nothing to mild skin irritation all the way up to organ damage and neurological problems. And as a result, Apcc, in cooperation with some researchers at the University of New Hampshire, Nancy Leland being the primary person we worked with, and some folks at EPA, we've developed a methodology that allows us to do a same-day analysis of presence of cyanobacteria and provide same-day notice to the general public and the municipalities of the absence or presence of concerning levels of cyanobacteria. So any pond that had a concerning level of cyanobacteria in 2020 is listed here as red. About 35% of the ponds that we evaluated in this report had conditions that were deemed to be unacceptable and warrant some restoration or remediation. That said, our findings over now 3 years of doing this would lead us to believe that the conditions necessary for degraded water quality to become apparent exist in actually probably majority of our ponds. And that the local conditions in any given year are what drives whether a particular pond experiences a round of unacceptable water quality or not. So what do I mean by local conditions? What I mean is, especially now where, these big downpours, 2, 3, 4, 5 inches of rain are becoming more commonplace as the atmosphere is warmed. They don't fall uniformly across the region. You can get a very heavy rainstorm. You can talk to someone in Mashpee. I'm telling somebody it's raining cats and dogs. I'm talking to somebody in Chatham and like, what are you talking about? It's gorgeous out here. And those heavy rain events can be responsible for washing significant amount of nutrient off the land surface into the pond, and can create a local condition that spurs a bloom. You can have regional differences in weather patterns, more sun, more fog, more clouds, that all factor into creating a situation that, given that all these ponds tend to be somewhat nutrient enriched, given that they're all vulnerable, tips some over and some not. And we don't yet understand enough about what the conditions are that trigger these blooms to be able to predict with sufficient accuracy very far in advance when a pond is going to experience a problem. So the data tends to show us that about a third of the ponds that we have been monitoring in a growing number of ponds over the course of the years, about a third consistently have conditions that are deemed unacceptable in any given year, but almost all of them are vulnerable. And they're vulnerable, again, because we rely on septic systems. There's too much application of supplemental fertilizers on lawns and landscapes close to these ponds. And there's too much untreated stormwater that also washes nutrients, fertilizers, and waste from roadways, public and private, onto the watersheds or directly into these ponds. And all of those things combined are creating problems that are reflected in the coloration of each individualized pond. I will say before I jump to the next that we run a sampling program that of varying lengths, depending on the pond and the town that we're working in or the association we're working with, that looks at cyanobacteria ponds. This past year in 21, we looked at 133 sites in 123 ponds, which was a significant jump up from what we did in 2020, which is what this map is based on. We're intending to grow the number of ponds under monitoring and surveillance in the summer of 22. And during that sampling season, we do run a cyanobacteria map that's updated on a daily basis for the ponds which we are monitoring. So if we get a sample that indicates a problem or that we suspect, given the sample, that while there may not be an unacceptable level of cyano present in a pond the day we took the sample, but we think it's coming, you can check our website on a day-to-day basis to get as current information as there is to be had of what the conditions in any one of the ponds that we're monitoring is. So I would encourage you to think about visiting our site with some frequency in the summer. We also have a listserv so that if any pond pops up as problematic, even if it's not the pond you live on or you recreate on, you can get an email notice from us on the end of the day, every day, 5 days a week during business days, letting you know that a particular pond has an issue. So the whole emphasis around the cyano program is to give people the information they need to make informed decisions about where they want to be close to the water. Lastly, we looked at water supplies. And this is a uniquely Cape Cod thing. There are 15 towns or 20 municipal water supply systems on the Cape. The town of Barnstable has 5 by itself. And so what we did here was we evaluated the quality of the finished water provided by the water suppliers as it enters their distribution system. So it's post withdrawal from the ground, it's post treatment if there is any. How's that water as it comes out of the system? And 13 of the 20 had excellent scores. And that's good news. It's not quite so good as our 2020 and 2019 reports, when all 20 had excellent water quality. The 6 that have good water quality had a combination of either a reporting problem, they missed a state water quality mandated deadline for reporting, or they had a coliform bacteria result that was of concern, that required a retest, and that upon retest, it was determined that they did not in fact have bacteria levels that would have resulted in the requirement of a remedial action. And so there was no public health threat in those systems, but they received a good as opposed to an excellent. We have one water system in the town of Wellfleet that actually had, in addition to a coliform bacteria excursion, they also had a violation of an E. coli standard that resulted in a requirement to advise consumers to boil their water prior to consumption. That lasted several days. That did represent a modest public health threat and was the reason why that system received a poor grade. All that said, our experience has been in looking at the water supply across the region that the source waters are of high quality, and that generally speaking, water suppliers provide a high quality product to their consumers. And that's no accident. And the reason it's no accident is that decades ago, a public policy consensus was achieved and that recognized that the management of and protection of groundwater sources, either current drinking water supplies or areas that would serve as future well supplies, that it was an important public policy goal to protect those areas. And towns bought land around drinking water supply areas. They zoned protectively through water protection overlay districts to limit potential hazardous waste activities close to the wells. And because the water suppliers and the broader communities placed a value on clean water, they managed it in such a way that we continue to reap the benefits of that foresight. It stands in stark contrast to the valuation and behavior that we've engaged in as a broader community around our ponds and around our estuaries. Rather than protect the land areas most critical to the protection of those resources, we have tended to build most intensively in those areas, rather than invest in wastewater infrastructure to remove the nutrient load from the waste stream We have relied on backyard septic systems that, as we discussed before, effectively do nothing to lower the impact of septic waste disposal on water quality. And as a result, we have a lot of red on those maps. So in many respects, the region brought this on itself. And it was only when population, density, the sheer number of people, and the duration over which we've been pumping large volumes of nutrients into our groundwater began to be experienced by the water bodies that we've begun to see the impact of those decisions and that lack of management and investment has had on the water quality that we all come to rely on. That's why a lot of us are here. So flip side of the water supply coin is that, and the lesson here is that, aggressive land use management to protect water resources works, but only works where you do it. We've done it on water supply. We've done a rather terrible job as a broader community in managing our wastewater. Only a small portion of the town of Falmouth, town of Barnstable, town of Chatham, and the town of Provincetown have any portion of their community serviced by publicly owned wastewater treatment facilities. 97-ish% of the parcels on Cape Cod rely on something other than advanced wastewater collection and treatment by the municipality to manage their wastewater. So it's no wonder that we have the problems that we have. And it's no wonder that coming up with a political consensus and a financing plan that allows us to remediate those problems has been an elusive and difficult consensus to achieve, but one, not to end my remarks on a downer note, but one that to the contrary, provides a lot of optimism. A number of towns have begun to move forward with their wastewater management programs. And there have been a number of funding initiatives at the state, and now most recently through the federal infrastructure bill, significant investment and provision of new tools and new sources of funding that are very important to communities and have allowed Cape towns to actually move forward with their wastewater management programs in a way that is not unaffordable, not punitive to the year-round rate base that would otherwise going to be asked to bear an unbearable burden of finance. We actually now have the tools and the ability to do this work, and towns are moving forward. So while the trend line continues down, there's good reason for optimism on what we're seeing. So I will stop and go back to Amanda, and I'm happy to field questions.
Thank you so much, Andrew. We are going to go ahead and start our audience Q&A. And we have a lot of questions coming in, so we should jump right into it. The first one is, does the Cape have prohibitions on lawn fertilizer containing phosphorus?
No. So there's a complicated regulatory framework here. So I believe 8 of the 15 towns on the Cape have a local regulatory authority in place that allow them to regulate the application of fertilizers on lawns. Nobody banned it, but there are limitations on proximity to water, resources, setbacks, to move fertilized areas away from pond edges, seasonal limitations that will limit applications of fertilizers to the growing season. About a decade ago, the state of Massachusetts, through its Department of Agricultural Resources, passed a regulation preempting municipal authority to regulate or ban fertilizer applications on residential and commercial properties. So those towns that did pass a rule have them in place. Those towns that chose not to don't have the choice right now. One of the issues that APCC has been working on the legislative and administrative front with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts has been to restore towns' discretion to regulate. But as of right now, we do not have that authority.
How does one determine if water quality is acceptable or unacceptable? What are the standards?
Okay, so it depends on the water body that you're talking about. So for the estuaries, there's a set of state regulations called Massachusetts Water Quality Standards, which have parameters, chemical parameters for certain compounds, and narrative criteria where no such chemical standard exists. And largely, as it relates to our estuaries, the narrative criteria speak to the aspects that one would tend to associate with a healthy resource. It's good water clarity. There's an existence of naturally occurring eelgrass beds. There's sufficient dissolved oxygen to support a range of aquatic life. You have a firm sandy bottom as opposed to a mucky organic bottom. And the state, through the Massachusetts Estuaries Project, has, and working with the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, has evaluated almost every estuary in Cape Cod, applied those criteria in the narrative standard, and issued findings, or has the data to issue findings that support a determination that these are all impaired waters. And so that's the standard that that we're applying and coming up with this color coding. In the ponds, again, there are some narrative criteria. There's not much of a data set out there. So the criteria that we have applied has been where there is a violation of a narrative or numeric standard, it would fail, or if there were a sufficiently high rate of cyanobacteria present that resulted in a closure, that also constitutes a failure. But that's somewhat different than the state standard that applies. But lakes are not treated as consistently as the estuaries are. And for the drinking water standards, it's actually, they're the easiest ones to rate because there are a full range of state and federal primary and secondary drinking water contaminant levels that are acceptable in drinking water. There's routine testing and there's public reporting of those results. So what we were able to do with the water supply map is every water supplier, unbeknownst to most of their customers, has to publish something called a consumer confidence report each year that they make available by July 1st of the year following the year they're evaluating. In that report, they have to document whether there were any violations of any standards. We just basically went in and read their reports and made it a lot easier. Instead of having to go to 20 public water supply websites, you can go to our map.
It appears that the eastern coast is not affected. Please explain.
There are no estuaries. I mean, the only estuary facing the east coast of the Cape is the Pleasant Bay estuary system in Chatham. And so that one is on the map. But there just simply aren't any enclosed bodies of water on the east facing side of Cape Cod.
When you say the blue dots represent acceptable water and the red ones are unacceptable water, are you referencing the drinking water in those areas or the swimming water or something else?
The color codings reflect the quality of either the specific freshwater lake or pond or the saltwater estuary. It's not a commentary or an evaluation of the underlying quality of the groundwater, and it is not a reflection of conditions in a particular private well or an individual well in a public water supply system. The map that we showed that has the stars associated with it evaluate the quality of the drinking water after it's been taken out of the ground, but before it goes into the distribution system. And I will point out, just for people who want to dive deeper, I showed you static maps of our findings. If you go on the website, you will have the ability in any one of these three to zoom in on that particular water resource of interest to you. And as you get closer, especially in the estuaries, you'll begin to see where the individual water quality stations are within the embayment. For the water supply, you'll be able to see where the individual well points are within the system that comprises it. And if you go further down, you'll be able to get to the raw data that exists for each one of those stations, locations, or well points. So if you want to see the raw data, this provides you, through that zooming in function, the ability to get down into the underlying data spreadsheets. And we provide that knowing that 75% of our readership is fine at the high level and might go down one level, but there are people with whom we work who are interested in what's underneath it and want to look at the data themselves. This gives you one place to go through our apcc.org site to find all that underlying data and do with it whatever analysis you want to do.
Are there no ponds in Truro or PT?
There are a small number of freshwater ponds in Provincetown and Truro. Very few of them were under monitoring in the 2020 summer season. We did have more ponds in the Outer Cape in the 2021 season, and we're looking for more to do in 22.
Can you explain the eutrophication and how nitrogen impacts ponds?
Sure. So eutrophication is a term that reflects the sort of status of the health of a water body. And so there's three phases: oligotrophic, clear, new waters, low nutrient, very clear; mesotrophic, which are transitional waters, still very high quality, but moving towards a more nutrient enriched, more plant filled environment; and eutrophic, which a lot of our ponds are moving towards. And they are, not the healthiest of ecosystems. And they are, for ponds, part of a progression over time where ponds tend to accumulate over thousands of cycles of growth and death of aquatic plants and leaf litter, a slow filling up from the bottom of the pond to transition to a more of a wetland type system. And what happens over time is that human beings have put their thumb on the scale and accelerated that natural transition across that spectrum and created eutrophic conditions. And the driver for eutrophic conditions in the marine environment is nitrogen. The driver for freshwater conditions has long held to be phosphorus, although we are beginning to understand that there's a greater relationship between the nitrogen and phosphorus ratios in freshwater environments, especially as it pertains to cyanobacteria, than we would have once thought. But, if you look at a bag of fertilizer, the first number is nitrogen, second number is phosphorus, and so you can see, that's what you buy when you put it down on your lawn. People tend to fertilize with the idea that a little bit's good, so a lot must be better. And plants on the ground, grass, can only take up so much nutrients. And what they don't take up finds its way through successive rainfalls, or in a heavy rain, a gully washing wash, right direct into the pond and becomes bioavailable to the plant organisms and creates that cascading loop of bad effects that we've already talked about.
Is the plant Otis machine gun facility going to be a problem to our water?
So for those that aren't aware, the National Guard has proposed a multi-purpose machine gun range on Joint Base Cape Cod that will result in a clear cut of about 170 acres of managed forest and the setting aside of 5,000 of the 15,000 acres on the base for an impact area. That is the same general area that has been set aside as the Upper Cape Water Supply Reserve that serves and provides water supply and potential water supply for 6 Upper Cape towns and more directly to Mashpee, Falmouth, Bourne, and Sandwich. The National Guard has done their own environmental assessment, put it out for public comment, got about 400 comments, 90% of which were negative or raised concerns about habitat, carbon sequestration, and potential drinking water impacts of the proposal. They deemed none of those negative comments to be sufficiently serious enough to warrant a single change in their environmental assessment. So they blessed their own environmental assessment internally within the military, thus avoiding an external environmental impact statement that would have had to be reviewed again publicly and adjudicated by the EPA. And so, yes, long answer to a short question. As an organization, we believe firmly that it's the wrong facility in the wrong place for the wrong reasons. It is awaiting its final administrative review by a state organization called the Environmental Management Commission that has the legislatively authorized authority to disapprove any training activities on the base that are found to be inconsistent with habitat and water supply protection and management on the Upper Cape Water Resources Reserve. We've been making the case that this, on its face, this project does not meet that standard. There is no schedule for the Environmental Management Commission to consider the project at this point. And anyone who's interested in it, again, I'll refer you back to our website. We have voluminous information about our concerns. We have provided the full public record of all the comments to the military's environmental assessment. And oh, by the way, we had to put a public records request to the military for them to release public comments to us, not military secrets, public comments. There's a action button that allows you to communicate directly to the 3 environmental commissioners of environmental protection, conservation, recreation, and fisheries and wildlife, who comprise the Environmental Management Commission, and lets you share your concerns with or support for this project with them directly. And yes, I feel strongly about this project.
You spoke, sorry, I skipped one. APCC's work seems to focus on the mainland Cape Cod's water quality. Would you be able to assume that the surrounding islands, such as Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, face the same water quality issues?
I can tell you from the work that I used to do when I was with Mass DEP on the estuaries that their saltwater resources are experiencing this and are under the exact same types of stress as the Capes. So nutrient enrichment from septic systems is an issue on the islands, on both islands. They're experiencing, to my knowledge, but I don't quantify it, some emergence of cyanobacteria concerns in some of their freshwater ponds. There aren't that many freshwater ponds on either island, but we have talked to them a little bit about it. And I think the issues around drinking water are the same. So, the islands benefit from, there's a slightly higher amount of protected lands. They have lower population densities. So they're under the same pressures, but I would suggest probably not as far down the rat hole as we are across the board.
You spoke about freshwater systems managed by our towns. You didn't talk about the water well systems we have in our section of Sandwich and other areas of the Cape. What should we know about our freshwater wells, and what actions to take to protect those freshwater sources?
Okay, so it kind of depends. The Sandwich Water District is the water supplier for the town of Sandwich, and they have a variety of wells. And if you want to see them, you can zone in on the map and see where their individual sources are. And you can also get into their consumer confidence report to see how the raw water from each of those individual sources stacks up to state and federal permitting requirements. There are a number of homes in Sandwich that continue to be supplied by private wells. I live a stone's throw from Sandwich. In Mashpee, I'm on a private well. And private well owners are pretty much left on their own. There is no municipal either testing requirement once a well is approved for installation on an ongoing basis, nor is there any municipal sampling of private wells. So my advice to you would be, if you're on a private well, it would be appropriate to get a broad spectrum sampling of your water supply on an annualized basis so that you know what's in your source water. You know, as a general rule, whatever you put down the drain is going to end up in the groundwater. And whatever ends up in the groundwater is going to show up at a pond, an estuary, near coastal waters, or somebody's drinking water supply. And so doing as much as you can to reduce the introduction of contaminating chemicals into the groundwater through choice of cleaning products, household products, minimizing the use of chemicals, pesticides, fertilizers in your lawn area. Those all contribute in very small pieces on a house by house basis to maintaining water quality region-wide.
So we have about 12 questions left, so we're going to try to power through just so we're cognizant of everybody's time. So here's the next one. I see that Cliff Pond in Nickerson Park was unacceptable. Is this posted at the pond? Did you test all the ponds in Nickerson Park?
We do not test all the ponds in Nickerson Park. We work in collaboration with the Brewster Ponds Coalition to do a subset of the ponds in Brewster. Nickerson or Cliff, quite frankly, has been a source of contention between ourselves and the park managers. They use a different approach to quantifying cyanobacteria threat. And so in general, we have tended to view conditions at Cliff Pond to be of greater concern than they. As a state agency, they don't rely on the Brewster Health Department to issue a warning, but they rely on the State Department of Public Health. And so they have been more reluctant to issue use restrictions than some of the surrounding boards of health. When there is a use restriction, it is posted, but I would encourage you, if you're concerned about Cliff, we'll be monitoring them next year, so just check our website.
Has the Centerville River been tested?
Centerville River is part of an estuarine system in Centerville, that 3-bay system that has been tested. And if you, again, go to the map on the website, you can zoom in and you'll be able to see the individual water quality stations in the Centerville River and do your assessment of what those findings are.
Do the water quality studies include review of PFOS/PFOA levels?
Not yet. So what you're referring to is perfluorinated compounds, which are basically a family of fire retardant chemicals that are fairly ubiquitous in the consumer products world. They're the basis for nonstick pans, stain resistant upholstery, Gore-Tex water resistant outerwear, firefighting foams. It's the stuff that keeps the food in your spray can from sticking to the edges. It's everywhere. Massachusetts first began requiring water suppliers to test for perfluorinated compounds in 2021. So this 2020 report does not reflect the findings of that water supply sampling for PFAS compounds that occurred last year. That will show up in a report that we will update this year. And I can tell you right now that a number of the water supply systems that received higher grades in 2020 are going to see a downgrade because of the presence of PFAS compounds in their source water. That said, most of them are doing a really good job keeping it from getting into the distribution system. So there's a distinction between its presence in source water and its actual presence at the end of your faucet. Towns have been able to either take supplies that are contaminated with PFAS compounds offline, blend them with other clean supplies so that the amounts being provided to the consumer are below health standards, or treating them through the installation of granular activated carbon filters to protect the health of the consumer. But it's a big issue, and it's going to be a bigger issue.
Do you have a program for volunteers to measure ponds?
We do. We actually have a volunteer page on our website. So if people are interested, I would encourage you to go sign up for that. We're in the process now of talking to towns, talking to homeowner associations, talking to watershed associations to determine who's interested in partnering with us for the sampling season of 2022. So I can't tell you today or next month, frankly, which ponds we're going to be doing this upcoming year, but we do rely heavily on citizen scientists to assist with certain aspects of the data collection and sample collection and transport.
If water quality is good, what is the issue with high rates of breast cancer that some link to Cape water?
I'm not qualified to answer that question.
What about forever chemicals?
Those are the PFAS compounds. So, we're just now, 2021 was the first year in Massachusetts, not just on the Cape, where there's been a mandatory requirement to sample for 6 of what are a family of thousands of compounds. So we're just at the very earliest stages of understanding the distribution, concentration, and degree of presence in water supplies across the state.
What about okay, we already talked about the machine gun range. What is the status of toxic chemicals in the groundwater and the prevalence of breast cancer? You had commented on that earlier, Andrew.
Yep.
Please address PFA, and I think you also addressed.
We just did, yep.
Yeah. Do private cesspool improvements help? Are they expensive?
They are expensive. Cesspools and septic systems. Cesspools are a more primitive iteration of the current modern day septic systems, which are pretty primitive in their own right. A perfectly functioning state standard code compliant septic system that meets Title V of the State Environmental Code does absolutely nothing to reduce nutrients entering our waters and is largely responsible for degraded water quality that we have. There are a class of what's known as innovative alternative septic systems, which have the ability to reduce nitrogen levels to lower amounts than you'd find in a common septic system. The issue is that, roughly speaking, most of our estuaries can't be healthy with nitrogen inputs greater than 3 milligrams per liter. The best performing experimental alternative systems get you down in the upper single digits, which, while a significant improvement, doesn't by itself get you down low enough to fully resolve our water quality problems. So improving backyard septic systems in certain areas with certain technologies, and hopefully some that are likely to get approved in the next several years, is an important part of a comprehensive solution. But reliance on alternative septic systems as the singular solution, especially in the alternative to collection and treatment, will not get us to achieving our water quality goals. And none of the alternative systems on the market or anywhere close to full approval do anything meaningful to reduce phosphorus, and therefore their utilization around freshwater ponds, while it will reduce the nitrogen levels and ultimately flow to the estuaries, won't do anything meaningful to improve water quality in the ponds. So it's a complicated answer. Everybody wants to say that there's some cheap, inexpensive, easily installed, low maintenance, silver bullet IA system that I can put in my backyard and don't bother me with sewers. That'd be great, but it's not true.
Can you recommend a firm or organization that will test our private well water for a fee and provide reliable results?
We don't have any ongoing relationships with water supply testing labs. I would suggest you contact your local board of health, ask them the same question, find out who they've had good experiences with providing reliable data that they've found to be consistent and of high quality, and go with one of those.
Does APCC have individual membership in addition to business memberships?
We do. In fact, the vast majority of our membership are individual homes. So we would encourage you, if you like the work we're doing, you think we're on the right track. We are a member sponsored organization. I would encourage you to take a look at our website. And if you like the work we do, we really appreciate your support and your membership.
What are the top 3 things I can do to alleviate these problems?
First and foremost, you should be communicating with your elected leaders at the town level, your board of selectmen in particular, but also your state reps and senators to impress upon them the priority that you assign to water quality. At the end of the day, how to solve this problem is not a mystery. It is, however, expensive and it's disruptive. And therefore, it requires a certain amount of commitment and political will and an understanding from the elected leaders of your community that the people who live in the community place a high value on water quality, and you're willing to bear the burden of cost and inconvenience associated with installation of the infrastructure necessary to solve the problem. If you convey to your elected leaders that this is something, conditions we've talked about tonight are unacceptable, and that you want something better to preserve the value of your investment, to preserve the reason why you're on Cape Cod and why you choose to live in their community. If you tell them that, they will take that cue and do something about it. So that's number one. Number two, get involved, get educated. Do what you can, and we have a lot, and we didn't touch on it at all tonight, and I apologize for that. But a lot of choices that you make on your own property about how much lawn you have, how you treat your lawn, what types of native species or plantings you put on your yard goes a long way towards minimizing the impact of your particular home on water resources of concern. We have a ton of great information on our website about how to minimize your property's impact on water quality. I would encourage people to do that. And lastly, just be cognizant of the fact that whatever you put down the drain in the ground or on the ground finds its way to the water and therefore finds its way to you. So don't do it.
Last question, is it safe to swim in a pond that your map shows is unacceptable?
It's advised for the period of time when it's deemed to be unacceptable to restrict your access to that and your exposure to that pond. But it's very common that a pond will experience an upset and it clears up in 2 weeks and the rest of the season can be fine. There are also situations like Santuit Pond in Mashpee, and I saw a name on here, Lapis, who I think lives on Santuit and bought their house from us. If it is you, ponds like Santuit that are hazardous for contact for 6 months of the year. So if you're worried about it, I would suggest that you go to our website and you'll be able to see for any given week what the conditions are in that pond. And I also think read up a little bit on some of the source material in our site, and you'll find information that will help you understand the conditions and the look of a body of water that might give you pause to think that maybe there is a higher level of cyanobacteria than you might otherwise be comfortable with. And use that information, educate yourself. Don't rely on somebody else to advise you about what's best in your own best interest.
Awesome. Well, Andrew, thank you so much. This has been tremendous, an incredibly enlightening presentation. And I think we got through almost all of the questions, which is fantastic. So without further ado, I'm going to toss things back to Len DiLorenzo, who is going to close out our program.
Thank you, Andrew, for your sobering presentation. And to our attendees, we appreciate your participation, and we hope you will complete a 2-minute survey, which you will receive tomorrow. This event has already helped us raise money for the Tufts Club Scholarship Fund. If you are so inclined, we hope you will consider making a gift to this fund. Amanda will post that link now so that you can do so online. Please take a look at the Tufts Club website for future events and for how to become a member of the Tufts Club. Have a wonderful rest of the evening, and please stay safe and wear your masks. Thank you.